here today with Gabriel Urza for our Dark and Stormy Night presentation. Gabriel received his Master's of Fine Arts from Ohio State University and his law degree from the University of Notre Dame. He spent several years as a public defender in Reno, Nevada. His family is from the Basque region of Spain, and he lived there for several years himself. His short fiction and essays have been published in the New York Times, The Guardian, Politico, River Teeth, Hobart, Earlia, The Kenyan Review, West Branch, and Slate. He has also published 2 books, a novel and a novella. His novel, All That Follows, was published in 2015 and tells the story of a politically charged act of violence that echoes through a small Spanish town. The New York Times Book Review called it a triumph. In 2019, Gabriel published the novella The White Death, an Illusion, the story of illusionist Benjamin Vaughan, who dies under mysterious circumstances at the height of his career and whose brief life is chronicled by an unnamed narrator who encountered Vaughan as a boy. Claire V. Watkins, author of Gold Flame Citrus, called The White Death a study of humanity's 2 best tricks, death and love. This darkly lush novella is written with a miniaturist's eye for detail and a mystic's eye for mystery. It left me exuberant with awe. Gabriel currently teaches fiction in the MFA program at Portland State University. Please join me in welcoming Gabriel Urza.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, and also thank you to Hobbs, who I think is watching as well, for the invitation to Dark and Stormy Nights. It was a real honor to be invited. I know you normally do these events in person, and I would love to meet you all in person at some day. So I'm definitely hoping to get out to Lincoln City at some point soon. Anyway, I wanted to start off with a little bit of an overview of my work, just because I'm sure probably most of you aren't that familiar with my work. So I put together a little PowerPoint, and I think we're going to touch on a little bit of everything today. I wanted to talk about my biography really briefly, just in the way that it relates to the things that I write about. But then we're also going to talk a little bit about Spanish and Basque history, because the book that I'll primarily be reading from, All That Followed, is set in the Basque country, which is a part of Spain. And there's sort of a fraught political history there that's at the center of the book. So I want to give you all a sense of what that dynamic was and how it plays into the novel. And then I thought I would read a few chapters, and don't worry, my chapters are very short. I go for the Dan Brown approach to chapter writing. But I thought I'd read you 3 chapters, which are from 3 different characters' points of view, just to give you an idea of like how the story is told and how the characters and points of view kind of bounce off of each other a little bit. And then if we have time, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about my novella, The White Death. It is really different than All That Followed. It's different in its setting, it's different in its tone, it's different in its preoccupations. It's about a magician, about a 14-year-old stage magician in the American West, like in the 1990s. So there's sort of like a different shift in terms of like, I don't know, emotional register maybe. But yeah, I'd be happy to read from that as well. All right, without further ado, so I made a little PowerPoint presentation, and I thought it would probably be better to have some photographs to look at instead of just like looking at me talk for an hour. So hopefully these are kind of interesting. And, Kirsten pointed this out at the beginning, but I do really enjoy having like organic conversations. So if you all have comments or questions, please do write them in the chat. And as we're going along, feel free to interrupt, and we can take those as they come up. Yeah? Okay. I will take, what's that?
I just said that sounds great.
Okay, good. I know there's not a whole lot of feedback. I just see 5 black screens with names. So I'll take that as universal support. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you all right now. Can you see that?
Yep, you can see it just fine.
Just fine, and I'm not blocking anything here?
Nope, you're good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I don't know why I made like a little title card here. Other than that, I took this photograph. I am not a photographer, but I love this photo. And it is set in the Winnemucca Valley, which is just north of Reno on the way up towards Oregon. It's an old, it's just part of the Great Basin. It's just all basin and range. And it is an old lake bed, which before that it was the old bed of an ocean. And it's just a really strange, mysterious place, a place that I spent a lot of time in and that I really love. And I don't think it really informs the two stories that we'll be talking about today, but it is a geography that I end up coming back to a lot in my nonfiction writing as well as in some of my shorter fiction. But mostly I just wanted to show off my photograph. Great lighting. All right, let's see. Okay. So to get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about what we would talk about today, just so you'll know kind of that there is a little bit of structure here and you can have a sense of where we're going. So I thought I'd start off by just giving a little bit of biographical information to tell you a bit about who I am, about where I grew up, and about what some of my influences were and how that shows up in my writing. And then I'll talk a little bit about my writing themes and preoccupations. These are just sort of like ideas or characters or conflicts or questions that I tend to come back to, whether it's in a book that's set in Spain or whether it's a novella that is, you know, set at a magic convention in Las Vegas or, you know, anywhere else. And then I'll talk a little bit about my novel, All That Followed. This is the novel that's set in Spain in the Basque Country, and there's a lot of historical baggage that goes along with the Basque Country, and I mean that it's a complicated place, and there's a lot of history there, and it really informs the present, and it informs the present of the book as well. So I'm hoping that I'm going to give you a brief historical lesson. Hopefully that doesn't scare anybody away. But it's just going to be about how we got where we are today in the Basque Country, and especially how we got to where this book starts and where this book ends. And I can talk a little bit also about some of the craft considerations, like the creative decisions that I was making as I was writing the book. Yeah, and then as I said, we can talk a little bit about the novella if we have time. And then I would love if people stick around and have some questions. I would love to talk about this writing or just about your writing, or about anything in general. So yeah, I look forward to like lecturing less and talking more shortly. All right. So I said I would start off with a little bit of my biography. I grew up in Nevada, in northern Nevada, in Reno. And there are, this is important in kind of a number of ways. The town that I grew up in, Reno, it's a gambling town, but it's not like a Las Vegas. It's sort of like a sad little Las Vegas. And so you still get a lot of the unique social and economic dynamics that come along with a gambling town. You have a really broad range of people. You have people that are just coming in for a weekend or for a night. You have people who are making a living or just sort of circulating more around the casinos, which occupy most of the downtown area. And then, you know, there's also just your standard suburbs. And so you just get weird mixes of people and places. You know, I think when I was growing up, when I was like in high school, most people kind of like, you know, sneak into bars or, you know, to go, you know, get a drink when they're underage. And, you know, my friends and I all had fake IDs and we would go like play blackjack down at the El Dorado. And it was a strange place to grow up. I don't think I realized how strange it was until after I left. And the other thing that I think is worth noting, I live in Oregon now. And I still get back to Reno every once in a while, but the Reno that I grew up in is really non-existent anymore. You know, it's changed so much, it's grown a ton. And even the sort of centers, the economic engines of the town have changed a lot. The Tesla Gigafactory is right outside of Reno now. And so a lot of the industry and a lot of this kind of like revenue that the city depends on now is coming from tech. And so that's just a different dynamic. And like the downtown feels less like a place that's built around casinos, and it feels more like it's becoming more of a place to host giant tech companies. So that's its own thing. Yeah, let's see. Oh, I included this slide because I feel like this gives hopefully an idea of some of the strangeness of Reno. Reno is located right on the border between the desert of the Great Basin and the Sierra Nevada. And so, if you drive 10 minutes to the east, you're out in the desert. And if you drive 10 minutes to the west, then you're up in the mountains. And so what happens is you have these kind of confluences of nature and urbanization. And so these are a couple of screenshots I took a couple of years ago of a news headline where a mountain lion was, I'm going to say arrested, but probably the more accurate term would be sedated, after it went into a casino in downtown Reno in the middle of the morning. Stuff like this happens in Reno, like we had, when I was going to college there was a bear on campus. Another time there was a coyote living in my backyard, and I live like in town. So there's this weird kind of confluence between like the desert and wilderness, and then the city. And yeah, I think for me as a writer, what I have come to appreciate is that there is just a lot of plot that exists in a place like that. There's a lot of tension, there's a lot of room for story, and it's something that I try to draw on a lot. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about my Basque heritage, because it is a part of the book, and it really informs how I got to write all that followed. Both sides of my family came from the Basque Country. My dad was from the Spanish Basque Country, and his family, and he moved to Idaho in the 1950s. My mother's family came from the French side of the Basque Country and moved a bit earlier than that. And I actually included here, if you see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's like a photograph, an old black and white with a bunch of sheep. Those are actually, it's an old photograph of my great-grandfather's sheep up kind of near Lake Tahoe. There's an old family like story that he could have bought a half mile of beachfront property in Tahoe, but he said no because they had terrible grass for the sheep to graze on. So yeah, and then just to touch really briefly on like my education, not that I think I bring this up more to say that there are a lot of ways to come to writing. And I don't know how many of you here are writers or aspiring writers, but I think that having sort of like a diverse background and experience can really help. So the way that I got into writing more seriously, I'd always been interested, but I ended up going to law school really early on, basically out of undergraduate. And then I moved back to Nevada and I became a public defender for about 5 years. And that was an amazing experience. And amazing is maybe a bit euphemistic, because it was definitely not all good, but it wasn't all bad either. I was 25 years old when I came back, and I remember I found out I got a job at the public defender's office, contingent on me passing the bar exam. And I found out that I passed the bar, and literally the next day I was in a courtroom, hyperventilating, I should specify. It was a terrible idea. In retrospect, it was a really bad idea, but I did get thrown in, and I learned a lot. And I saw firsthand really how everything that I had been told about how the criminal justice system works and its shortcomings and who it protects and who it fails to protect. I also saw, really how laws get made and who they're there to benefit. In Nevada, when I was working there, a lot of the laws were there to benefit casinos. Now I think it's probably actually more big companies. But from a writer standpoint, it was a gold mine. I was taking notes the whole time that I was there. I remember the first year that I was in the public defender's office, I was in judge's chambers, and I walked by a judge's door, and within an hour, he had been shot in that office. There was a client that had been in his classroom that shot him from a parking garage across the street. And so that was sort of an eyes wide open moment for me. I also, learned more about the town that I had grown up in and that I had thought I had known. I was working with people, that I almost recognized from living in town. And I found out what their backgrounds were. I found out how mental health and substance abuse issues affected people's lives in a way that I couldn't really imagine before that. And I also noticed the effects of the job on lawyers. I saw two, I didn't see, but two district attorneys that I knew took their own lives while I was there. And I saw a lot of other attorneys struggle and fail with addiction issues and family issues and things like that. And it comes with being around that work. So I lasted about 5 years, and, to be candid, I kind of burnt out. And I had applied for a Master's of Fine Arts program at Ohio State University. And it was kind of a lifesaver in a lot of ways. It gave me 3 years to sort of step out of the trauma of the public defender's office and try to make sense of that experience. But more importantly, it also just gave me a chance to live and breathe writing for 3 years. It was a real gift, and it's something I'm really thankful for. And it was there that I started working on All That Followed. My thesis was a shorter draft of All That Followed. When I finished, I ended up going back to public defense work because I needed to make money, and that's what I knew. But I did finish the book, and then in 2015, I published it with Henry Holt, which is, they did a great job. It was not an easy book to publish, I think, just because of where it was set, because of the kind of book it was. But I was really grateful to have it out in the world, and it also allowed me to have some flexibility with my career. So I ended up focusing more on the writing and then also on teaching. And so I'm currently teaching creative writing at Portland State, which I absolutely love. And it also gives me some time to continue working on my own writing. Any questions? We all good? All right. I just really wanted to touch on some of the themes and preoccupations that tend to come up in my work. And I think, you'll see these, even though they look different. I think these themes and preoccupations are going to come up in the books that I'll be reading to you from today. Not surprisingly, a lot of my experience in the criminal justice system tends to show up. I write nonfiction too. So I included just a couple of examples of some nonfiction articles that I've written that are really about sort of like regional identity, Western identity, but then also about the criminal justice system. So I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times that was about fly fishing, and about when I was a public defender, there were these groups of prosecutors and defenders and police officers that were fly fishermen, and we would go out and at the end of the day or on weekends, and we would all hang out and have a beer and fish, for trout in the rivers and the lakes. And it wasn't until I left that I realized how much those personal relationships in the law affected the clients that I worked for and affected the outcomes of their cases. So anyway, that's what that story is about, or what that essay is about. I wrote an essay for Politico about sort of the idea of Nevada being a cowboy state, or politicians thinking that it's a cowboy state, even though it's really not. And about how anytime there's a politician in Nevada, he's always got on like a cowboy hat or like some shit kicker cowboy boots, and about how bad of an idea I think that is. And then the last thing here is also just an article. This is the first nonfiction piece that I ever really published. It was a story that fell into my lap, and I still think I felt so lucky. It was about a Army major named Jason Wright, who was a lawyer, an Army lawyer, and he was appointed to represent Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attack and was a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. And essentially, Jason was put in a position where he was going to get transferred off of his case because he was doing his job and defending his client. And you can understand that there's a lot of complex emotion and political considerations around that. The article is about exploring sort of his advocacy as a lawyer and his duty as a lawyer versus his duty as a soldier. So hopefully that gives you some idea. All right. So it's 4:20, I think we're good. Okay. Before we get into the book, all that followed, I wanted to just give some real brief history about the Basque Country and Spain in particular. First of all, I'm going to ask you all, not to put you on the spot, but a show of hands. I think there's a little thumbs up icon or however you want to do it. How many folks have been to Spain here, if any? All right, I got Catherine. And then has anybody been to the Basque Country? Nope, Catherine's hand just went down. Okay, well, good. Well, I like talking about the Basque Country a lot, so let's jump into it. There's a map here that gives you some idea of where the Basque Country is in relation to Spain. It's basically a little corner of Spain up in the northeast. It's on the Pyrenees Mountains for the most part, and it's also up against the ocean. And it borders France. Actually, a couple of the provinces of the Basque Country are in France. But when you think politically about the Basque Country, it tends to be Spain. And this has a lot to do with Spanish history that we'll get into in just a minute here. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna switch slides here, I think. Yeah, the history of the Basque Country. So, the Basque people are an indigenous people, which means that they've basically been in this region for as long as people can tell. You know, the last time I was there pre-COVID, I was doing an article for Travel and Leisure about art in the Basque Country, and the earliest Basque art that I found, well, it's interesting to think about whether it's Basque or not, but was Neanderthal cave art up in the mountains in the Basque Country. And it's not really a coincidence that the Basque people have sort of remained autonomous. It's a really geographically isolated place. It's up in the mountains. Most people just don't really want to mess with it when they're coming through. And by like people, I mean Romans, right? So it's had a fair amount of autonomy ever since, you know, as far back as history goes. But there's always been this tension between like Basque and Spanish governments. Other things that I think are important to know about just culturally about the Basque Country, other than that it has traditionally been separate, is that it has an indigenous language. It's like not a Romance language. It's called Basque. In Basque, the word is euskera. And it is, in my experience, very, very difficult to learn, especially if you're over 30 years old. I think my hard drive just needed to be updated. I've tried many times without much luck. But just to give you an idea of what the language sounds like, if you say thank you in Spanish, you say gracias. If you say thank you in Basque, you say eskerrik asko. If you say yes in Basque, you say bye. And if you say no in Spanish, you say yes. So it's confusing. And it's a really, you know, unique language. And language will really come into Basque history and also into all that followed as well. It's becoming sort of a cultural signifier, a political signifier in interesting ways. I included a couple of pictures here just to give you some idea of like physically, geographically, what it looks like. I mean, honestly, like maybe these aren't the most representative photographs because most of the Basque Country looks like most of the other places in Europe and the rest of the world. Unfortunately, you know, there's this sort of like homogenization that's happening now. And so you can grab a hamburger at McDonald's and, you know, a bad cup of coffee at Starbucks and all those wonderful things. But there are some sort of unique identifiers too. So the photograph on the far left is a festival. I don't remember what town that's in, but you can see there it's the Basque flag that's up, not the Spanish flag. The photograph at the top right gives you some idea of what the countryside is like. It's really mountainous, and there are these really small little towns. Like that would be considered a town, right? And then bottom right, there's a bar. Like a lot of the social life revolves around bars. And so, you know, you go to a bar at 11:30 at night and you'll see like 3 generations of a family there all together. You'll see like the 2-year-old passed out in a like you know, a pram, and then you'll see the parents, you know, having a couple of drinks at the bar, and then you'll see the grandparents kind of sleeping in the corner of the bar as well. The food is amazing over there as well. So if you have the chance to try some Basque food, I would highly recommend it. Okay. All right, here's where we get into the fun stuff, which is the political history. So probably the most important event to happen in Spain in modern history is the Spanish Civil War, which took place between 1936 and 1939. And the war started with a coup that was led by General Francisco Franco. Franco was, in my opinion, and the opinion of most, not a good person. He represented a very authoritarian, very Catholic, very Spanish nationalist identity. And so he overthrew a government that was socialist, I believe, at the time. And so on the other side of the Civil War were the Republicans, and the Republicans were socialists, they were leftists, they were also autonomous groups like Catalonia and like the Basque Country, who were fighting to maintain the sort of political independence that they had up until that point. Another really important event to happen during the Spanish Civil War was the bombing of Guernica by the Nazis. And that was done at the behest of the Franco government. It was, you know, probably in a civil war that was riddled with war crimes, and war crimes that we're still learning about now. There's still mass graves that are being exhumed. The bombing of Guernica stands out because it was an attack on a marketplace on market day, and it was brutal, and it killed families. It killed, you know, people from all over that region were coming to Guernica that day to go to market. It was the source of inspiration for the famous Picasso painting Guernica, which I think hangs now in the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. And Guernica also happens to be the town where a lot of my dad's family still lives. So, you know, when we go back and visit, you can still see evidence of the bombing. And when the Spanish Civil War concluded in 1939, Franco and the nationalists won. And they were not good winners, to put it mildly. They, you know, the next 40 years were brutal in Spain. Spain was in a lot of ways isolated at the end of the peninsula and at the end of Europe. And so what that meant was that language and culture and politics that were seen as being anti-Spanish nationalist were really cracked down on. And the economics in places that had gone against the Franco regime also were punished. So what that meant in the Basque Country is that it was illegal to speak the Basque language. It was illegal to dance Basque dances. The Basque government fled and was in exile. And, you know, it even went so far that the Spanish government went and changed the names of towns to Spanish last names. And there are also stories of Spanish guards breaking into graveyards to chip off the names, the Basque names, from headstones in the graveyards. So I think that gives hopefully some sense of what the conditions were like. Not surprisingly, in the 1950s, this revolutionary group started to form against the dictatorship. They were called Euskal Ta Askatasuna, which stands for Basque Homeland and Freedom. And they were basically this subversive group of Basque intellectuals that started an armed military resistance to the Franco regime. And they had, they lived fairly underground until about 1973. And by that point, Franco was an old man. It was pretty clear that he wouldn't be around for much longer. And it was also clear that the next person to succeed him was a figure named Luis Carrero Blanco, who was equally brutal. And so in 1973, Blanco was driving in Madrid, I believe, and his car drove over a pothole that was loaded with explosives. And they found his car, they removed it from a balcony, an apartment balcony 3 stories up. And that was the end of that line of secession. So when Franco died in 1975, they transitioned to democracy, but the ETA stuck around and they continued fighting for an independent Basque state. They targeted politicians, they targeted Spanish police, and they also killed a lot of innocent bystanders. So despite that, they were seen by a lot of people as being a terrorist movement, but they also had a lot of support within the Basque country. That takes us to 1997 and the killing of a Basque politician named Miguel Angel Blanco. And this was an event that I really remember because I was in the Basque country when this happened. I was going to university there. And basically a Basque politician was kidnapped and was ransomed. And when the ransom wasn't paid, he was shot and left for dead, and he eventually died. And this was really a turning point against popular support for the ETA. So it felt like a really pivotal moment for me. It was a moment that I was there for, and it was really the basis for all that followed. So I guess that brings me finally, slowly, hopefully that wasn't too slow of an introduction, but to the book. So I thought what I would do is I would just read to you from the book, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the structure. The book starts in 2004, 5 years after the killing of a local politician named Jose Antonio Torres. And he's kind of a fictionalized version of Miguel Angel Blanco. And let's see, the 3 characters, the 3 points of view that you'll be getting are, the first is from Yoni. Yoni is an American, he'd be called Johnny or John in the United States. He's an American in his 70s that has been living in the Basque country since the 1950s. The second point of view character is Mariana, and Mariana is the widow of the politician who was kidnapped and killed. And then the third character is a young man named Iker, who is sort of like this wannabe radical who ends up getting caught up in this kidnapping scheme and gets convicted for his participation in that. Any questions about just sort of like the characters or about Spain and the Basque Country ahead of time?
I actually had a question. Was your family involved at all in Basque separatism? Do you know, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I need to ask my father that more directly. My dad worked sort of in Basque politics and in the diaspora. And we always had, leftist Basque folks coming to stay with us. And he was there actually during the 1970s when the military stuff really took off. I don't think he directly participated, but he certainly knew people that were associated.
Catherine says, I have a friend here in Newport who has Basque Heritage, John Clark. Do you know him?
I don't actually know. I would love to meet him though. Yeah, it's funny how like the Basque diaspora find each other. I live in Hood River, Oregon, which is, like 12,000 people, and we just moved in. And our neighbors right next door, the last name was Irusta. And yeah, sure enough, he's from a town 10 minutes from where my dad was born. So We're around. I see maybe one in the chat. Oh yeah. Okay, cool. With that, I'll go ahead and read a little bit, yeah? So I'm just gonna read one chapter from each point of view, and this is just at the beginning of the book. All right, number 1, Yoni. This morning, the front page of the Diario Vasco, for once, shares the same headline as the other Spanish newspapers. Sabino Garamendi's newsstand is wallpapered with photographs of the Atocha train station in Madrid, each cover depicting train carriages that had burst from the inside as if they were overshaken cans of soda. The aluminum paneling peeled back, revealing their contents. Strips of dark fabric, handfuls of foam cushioning, bits of bone, women's shoes, the pages of a child's notebook. It is the 12th day of March, 2004. I slide money across the counter to Sabino and fold the diario under my arm before crossing the street to the Bolina. Estefana is just inside the kitchen at the end of the bar, a deep burgundy skirt beneath her stained white apron, and the briny smell of anchovies cooking in the frying pan fills the room. I knock on the wooden bar. When she looks up, I give a small wave to let her know that I have arrived and am ready for coffee. And then I return to the patio outside the bar. On television last night, it was reported by every national news station that although Prime Minister Aznar, as well as the king himself, had refused to directly implicate the group responsible for the attacks, all available evidence pointed to the Basque separatist group Euskadi Ta Askatasuna, the ETA. And though the residents of Muriga collectively denied this suggestion, spat on the sawdust-covered floors of the bars each time a new anchor used the word separatist, there was also an underlying air of shared guilt, of collusion in the bombings that had left, as of last night, 191 victims dead. People lingered quietly in the bars, whole families with their children sitting at long, stout oak tables around half-empty bottles of red wine, Coke cans filled with cigarette filters, uneaten plates of potato omelet or grilled prawns. I had lingered a bit. The Fernandez de la Rea family sent their youngest over to invite me, the old American, to a table crowded with small plates of food. And when the parents of the youngest children began to filter out, I joined the old men lined up against the wooden bar. It's in these moments of acute community that the delusions I live by, that I am part of this town, that I have earned my way into the life of Muriga and its people, are quickly and easily unraveled. By 11 last night, early for Muriga, most of the bars in the old part had emptied. Santi Echeverria refused my offer of a second glass of pacharan, but I agreed when he asked if I'd like to join him on a walk up the Ubera River. The evenings were still cool and a fine mist began before we had reached the cathedral. Chirimiri, Santi said forlornly. It's a word used to describe a type of rain that they say exists only here in the foothills of the Pyrenees, a rain so fine that an umbrella is useless against it, wisps of water blowing under the umbrella's cuff to cling to the rough whiskers of your cheeks at the end of the day. It's a poetic word, one of the first words of Basque I learned, and hearing it never ceases to conjure the image of the woman who explained its meaning my first week in Muriga more than 50 years ago. The woman and I had been leaning against the stone wall of San Telmo Cathedral, the same cathedral that Santi and I now passed. Chi, ri, mi, ri, she had said. The knees of my slacks darkened from the rain as she deconstructed the word, laying out its component parts for me to examine. Chi, ri, mi, ri. Now you. It had felt small and thin in my clumsy American mouth. I was accustomed to deep, round sounds, not these diminutive tisks against the front of my teeth. I had expected her to laugh, but instead she took my hand up in hers. Her fingers were cold and thin, and they vibrated lightly around mine. Chirimiri, she repeated slowly, holding my palm up to her mouth so that I could feel how little air came out. She leaned off the wall of the cathedral, closer to me now, so that our knees were touching, and she said the word again, that wonderful word, chirimiri. Primary investigation points to ETA, the front page now announces, as I unfold my paper against the patio table at the Bologna. It's still early morning, and it's unusual to be able to enjoy a morning coffee outside like this. And yet, the last 2 days have brought back a warm current from the Canary Islands that has pushed back against the Arctic current. I roll up the sleeves of my sweater, wipe my hands over constellations of sunspots spread across my pale forearms. I read the first few lines of the cover article, then turn to the sports section on the second to last page of the paper before placing it back down on the table. What can such an article convey, really? How many words are needed to announce an inexplicably horrible thing, to tell us that there will be no recovery from this? But Muriga has experience with these acts that erode the soul of a people. The bombing of Atocha, inevitably, has torn the stitches from a wound nearly 6 years healed, and this morning's stillness is evidence of the effort required to convince ourselves that our lives are still intact after the death of Jose Antonio Torres. I watch Mariana, his widow, crossing Zabaleta, holding their daughter, Elena, by the wrist. The girl is now 8 years old, nearly 9. She has her mother's features but the large, startlingly blue eyes of Jose Antonio. Behind her, Martin mops the walk in front of his small grocery at the corner of Achiaga and Zabaleta, stopping after every few passes to pull from a cigarette pinched between 2 fingers. A pair of boys I recognize from Colegio San Jorge speed along Calle Zabaleta on their motor scooter, their light blue Oxfords untucked, flicking behind them. They are 17 or 18, the same age Iker was the year he was arrested from Jose Antonio's abduction and murder. As Mariana approaches, I glance back into the bar where Estefana shuffles across the worn stone floor, the cup of espresso and milk in her hand resting on a thin brown saucer. She brings me the same cup of coffee nearly every morning, and yet today I am surprised by the sight of her, this sturdy, strong woman. For the first time, I notice the ribbons of white that have wound their way through the thick black brambles of her hair. I hear the scrape of her right shoe, which doesn't rise quite as high as the left, as it drags across the stone. She's become an old woman, I think, and as if on cue, the dragging right foot catches momentarily on the threshold of the door, and the white cup slides from the saucer with a scraping sound. A sound not unlike the diminutive first syllable of Chirimiri. There is silence, and then the cup explodes in a crest of ceramic shards and deep brown coffee. Estefana curses loudly, waves the back of her hand dismissively at the nearly unbroken sky above her, and turns back to the bar to begin another coffee. Mariana and Elena are just at the end of the block now, and both mother and daughter turn in my direction at the sound of the shattering cup. There is a moment, a fraction of a second, in which recognition outweighs history, when Mariana sees only an old friend before anger and disgust take over and she pulls the girl in the other direction, back across Zabaleta. When they turn the corner out of sight, I watch Estefana moving busily across around the coffee machine. I study the splinters of enamel and the spreading puddle of coffee as it grows bigger on the patio's white tile. My mind drifts to the exploding trains at Atocha, and I begin to imagine time slowing to a pause. The black rush of smoke stopping its ascent from the train platform, then churning slowly backwards. I imagine the heat of the explosion, the women's shoes, the bits of dark fabric, all flying back into the hull of the carriage, the peeled strips of aluminum being folded back around its passengers, ironed smooth again. I allow time to continue flowing in reverse, the world to continue this process of reconstruction. The morning's unseasonably warm winds begin to reverse, to flow back to the Canary Islands. The white streaks in Estefana's black mane retreat back into her scalp. Elena's spring jacket becomes unstitched. The small pieces of cloth are mended back into long bolts of fabric. The fabric is reconstituted into a row of cotton plants, and then into a handful of shrinking seeds, until finally the seeds are distilled into only sunlight. I allow myself more. I imagine a bullet spinning back into the rifled barrel of a stolen pistol, a blue Peugeot lifting from an ocean cliffside back onto a ribbon of asphalt. I imagined the world undone back to a spring day 6 years in the past, when I had not yet been set upon by the ghost of Jose Antonio Torres. All right, so it's 4:47. That was just the first chapter. So I had hoped to read a couple more, but I don't know if we have time. Kirsten, thoughts?
I think we could probably read a little more.
Cool.
I think everyone's enjoying it.
Okay, and they are like shorter chapters too, so hopefully it'll just give you a sense of like the different narrators too.
Great.
All right, the second one is narrated by Mariana, who is the widow of the councilman who was killed. When I was a girl, my grandmother told us the story of Maria de Aulesti, a witch tried in Muriga during the Inquisition in 1610. It's a ghost story that old women use to remind kids to go to mass on Sundays or to say the Lord's Prayer before they climb under the covers at night. A story that my own daughter, Elena, learned not from me or from her grandmother as she should have, but instead from Celia Persona's daughter, who told her at school. The way my grandmother would tell it, Aulesti, who everyone called La Cerda, the hog, was born into a family that had secretly practiced sorcery for generations. She was the unmarried daughter of a charcoal burner and was only 23 when the king's inquisitor, Albert de Galvez Cortázar, brought the formal charge of witchcraft against her. He made several allegations that La Cerda had caused damage to a farmer's crops, that she had murdered infants in their sleep by sucking the breath from their lungs, that she could take the shape of dogs and cats and pigs. My grandmother would pinch her gold pendant of the Virgin each time she told my cousins and me about the aquelarres, the witches' gatherings where La Cerda brought young women to feast on roasted bodies dug up from the churchyard near where the football fields are now. She described the girls' nightly orgies with the devil in La Cerda, consummated in a sulfurous yellow firelight. When La Cerda had been tried and sentenced by de Galvez, she was given a last opportunity to confess and save her life, but she refused. At dawn on the Thursday before the start of the Holy Week, the townspeople pulled La Cerda from her cell in the basement of the church. With de Galvez presiding, they burned her to death in her father's charcoal ovens along the river. According to the story that the old women in Muriga tell, as they forced her into the small iron chamber of the furnace, La Cerda began to vomit a black and green, evil-smelling liquid. This smell, this excretion, finally offered proof to the town that she was, in fact, in league with the devil. I always remember that phrase, evil-smelling. What did evil smell like? I wondered. My friends and I grew up in Muriga with the ghost of La Cerda, who was said to come to children who were bad Christians or who didn't obey their parents, and it worked for a while. Each time I ignored my prayers before bed, I would imagine La Cerda's smell, the smell of evil that her ghost carried with her, then rush out from under the covers to mouth the Our Father. But as I grew older, I began to skip prayers. I smoked cigarettes and let boys put their hands under my clothes. I did these things and waited for La Cerda, but she never came. It wasn't until my first year at the university in Bilbao, in a class on Basque anthropology, that I learned the real story of La Cerda. The professor, a feminist scholar from the University of Deusto, projected images of old church documents onto a screen. The documents were frayed at the edges, written in an old slanted script. One of the charges made against Maria de Aulesti was that she had tricked a local priest into her bedroom. The priest testified that she had poured a yellow powder down his throat while he slept, that the devil had led him into her bedroom with a resin torch, where he was discovered by La Cerda's father in the middle of the night. The professor pointed out that the documents we were reading had been recorded several years after La Cerda's death. They were excerpts from an old court transcript showing that the same priest who had accused the young woman of witchcraft had later made similar charges against 2 other girls in nearby villages. The final image was of an order bearing the seal of an archbishop, which excommunicated the priest in 1612 for acts against the church. The professor had used the story of La Cerda to illustrate her own point about the subordinate position of women relative to the church. but I'd always thought it had said something more. I wasn't interested in De Galvez. Had the professor really expected better from the church? Instead, I became preoccupied with the execution itself. It was the townspeople that had dragged Lacerda from the cell in the basement of the church, I kept thinking. The people among whom she had grown up, who had known her entire life. I imagined those familiar hands tearing at her clothes, scratching at her skin, pulling at her hair. How bizarre, I thought, that she must have known the women who locked the iron door, the man who set flame to the wood. Sometimes I feel like a new version of Lacerda, I told my mother a couple years after Jose Antonio's death. Why would you say something like that? She asked, setting her glass abruptly down on the kitchen counter. Don't ask us if you don't see it, I said, the way conversation stops when we go to the Bolina, how people look at me at the Aroski when I'm buying milk and eggs with Elena, even after 2 years. You can't think of it that way, my love, she said, scratching the back of my neck lightly. Nobody thinks of you as Lacerda. But still, once Elena had reminded me of the story, I couldn't shake it. I remembered all the old tricks my grandmother had used to repel ghosts from her old baseria at the edge of town, up against the ash forest below the fortress at San Jorge. An ox tooth placed on either side of the doorway, ashes made from fingernail clippings burnt with sage and saffron, smudged around any window facing north and east. What is this? Elena asked after school last week, holding up an ox tooth that I'd bought at a bazaar in Bermeo the week before. It's nothing, I said, taking the bleached white tooth from her hand. Why is it here? She asked. It was your father's, I lied. It's a good luck charm. I like to be reminded of him whenever we come home. She nodded, watching me curiously. I wonder how much she knows. If Celia Pressona's daughter has told her the story of Lacerda, has she also told Elena the story of her own mother, of her father, killed 6 years earlier? I put the jagged white tooth back at the foot of the apartment door, then smoothed Elena's hair behind her ear. Just leave it alone, love. All right, that is the end of chapter 2. Kristen, you think that's a good place to stop?
That's a good place to stop. That'll give us some time for any questions that folks have.
Cool.
I guess I can start the Q&A.
Sure.
I guess how does your writing process work? Are you like a meticulous planner, or do you tend more to like jump in and see where it takes you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I hear these rumors about people that wake up every morning at 4 and write for 2 hours, or people that have their whole novel plotted up on a wall, and I do none of that. And probably I should. I think as a consequence, it takes me forever to write a book. But I tend to sort of just I think I probably usually start with characters, and I have a character who catches my attention, or a couple of characters, and I start thinking about who they are and about how I inhabit their points of view. I also tend to once I start getting into story, doing research, and research sounds sort of like I'm in archives, kind of like looking for specific things. I just start doing the things that the characters do. I start reading up on, Basque history, but also what prisons are like in Spain, and what prison foods are there, yeah, things like that, where I tend to get kind of it feels really unproductive and it feels really compulsive, but it ends up showing up in my work in really weird ways. I'm teaching a seminar right now on research for writers, and I'm trying to get my students to do just this, which is just to kind of get weird and get outside of what they imagine their story to be, and find out how more information can change that story a little bit. Yeah. And I think to go back to the process question, I don't get up at 4 and write for 2 hours every day. I'm lucky in that I think I have a job where, for the most part, summers we have time. I don't get a ton of writing done during the school year because there's just a lot of work going on. But I usually jump in pretty deep, for 2 or 3 months in the summer and try to get a lot done.
Cool. Catherine asks, do you interact with writer Alberto Tria? I think that's the spelling. He deals with social issues.
Oh, Alberto Urza.
Oh, yes,
It's
Urea.
so funny. Like his name has come up like 5 times this week. I taught one of his stories this morning in my undergraduate class. I love his work. I think he's amazing. I'm also teaching him in that research class. He is of Basque descent, but he grew up in, I want to say like Southern California. I could be wrong. He has an amazing book called, I'm going to forget it now, The Devil's Highway. It's nonfiction. It's about a group of immigrants that are crossing over from Mexico and get caught out in the desert. It is meticulously researched. It's heartbreaking. It's an amazing book. But I don't know him personally. I would love to.
Catherine also asks, are you interested in magical realism? Do you see that incorporating that into your future writing?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think so. Like maybe not the way that like Gabriel Garcia Marquez does, like magical realism. But like with this book, with all that followed, I like to think that there's some like kind of magic in it. There's sort of like, there are characters that kind of like, they don't directly recur, but things and characters happen a couple of different times in different generations. And so a lot of the book is about like how history is like keeps echoing. And so I like to think about that as being like kind of magical. And then this book, my like actual little magic book, there's room for magic. I think it's a lot about the interpretation. There's the sort of form that this book takes is it's an academic in his 40s with a kid who looks a lot like me, who becomes obsessed with this magician who is like a phenomenon who died mysteriously. And there's all this sort of question about whether this kid who died was just a really amazing magician or just a kid, or whether there was something magical going on there. So like, I always like books where like the magic is unstable, you know? Does that make sense, Catherine? Was that Catherine that asked that?
Yes.
Cool.
And
What
she
did I
says
read
yes.
what did I read as a youngster? Oh man. So I'll be totally honest. I read a ton of comic books. I read The Far Side. I read Calvin and Hobbes. Hobbes, I don't know if that's where your nickname came from. I know your last name also. And then like what is the stuff that that I started kind of getting into? I like pretty standard stuff. Like when I was in high school, somebody gave me some like beat stuff, you know, like William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and all these guys who are just like, you know, doing a lot of drugs and seemed like they were having like pretty fun times. And you know, to be totally candid, they're not folks that I like tend to circle back to a whole lot more anymore. But every once in a while, you know, I had some great English teachers in high school and they gave us some great short stories that I still like fall back to. Yeah, great question though.
Are you working on any projects right now?
Oh, yes. And I also see a reading now question. I am working on, I feel like 12 projects right now, which I think is good. But it's just sort of like the nature, I think, of me being a slow writer and then publishing being kind of slow. But for the last long time, I've been trying to work on a novel about basically like that's set in a public defender's office in Reno. And I'm, you know, I've finished a draft of that now, and I just don't know what'll happen with it, which is weird. And then I have a collection of short stories that is pretty much ready to go. I think a lot of them have been published in journals, but they feel cohesive to me, but I don't know what I'll do with that either. And most recently, I'm working on a book of nonfiction that I'm really excited about. It is about a guy who's actually from like Washington and Oregon, this guy named Gene Savoy, who just led a really interesting life. He was an untrained amateur archaeologist, and he like moved to Peru in the 1950s to try to like discover lost cities, and that's kind of in quotes. And he ended up publicizing, you know, a lot of the information that he got was from locals who were in the area, but publicizing the locations of these really amazing, like Indiana Jones kind of stuff in the mountains and jungles of Peru. And he's a very complicated character, but a lot of the places that he drew attention to and a couple of his theories have turned out to sort of be vindicated. He also started his own religion out in the desert in Nevada. And central to his religion is the idea that you can gain power by staring directly at the sun. So I've been spending a lot of time down with those folks in the desert looking at the sun, and they are delightful. So, and what am I reading now on this? So that's a good question. I am reading a historical book about Nevada called The Money and the Power. I am also reading, I ended up actually sort of to coincide with this, I researched an article on magicians and magic schools in Las Vegas. And so I went down to Las Vegas and went to magic school. I'm not a magician, by the way, but I went down there for like a week, and I became friends with this guy, Josh J, who is like a world-class magician. And he just has a book that, he had a book that just came out like maybe 2 weeks ago. It is called, oh, I'm gonna space out. Oh, I don't know, but Joshua J. And it's awesome. It's such an interesting book. You don't have to be a magician to like it. I think there's a description on the cover by, you know, somebody who's blurbing it. And I thought it was such a great description. It just said, this is a book about being really, really, really good at something.
I love that. Jonathan mentions that the book, the story about the explorer sounds a bit like Mark Oshiro's book, Each of Us a Desert.
Oh, I don't know that book, but I'm going to read it. I got to hunt it down. Mark Oshiro, Each of Us a Desert. That's a great title.
And J.M. Bush says, my only time in downtown Reno was Halloween 1998 on a drive from Grants Pass, Oregon to Vegas. Halloween in Reno was a real trip.
Oh, that is like top-notch prime Reno sighting. When we were in the public defender's office, we used to go to the jail the day after Thanksgiving when they would release everybody from the drunk tank, just to see everybody come out with their sad little costumes, you know.
The walk of shame.
Yeah, it was probably not cool, but it was always interesting.
And Catherine says, when I was in Reno, I worked the Big Bertha machine. I still have my winnings.
That's amazing. You did better than I did, Catherine.
So yeah, Jonathan has more information there about the book.
Oh, cool.
Post-apocalyptic, where the sun caused the death of society. Sounds very cool.
I will definitely check it out. I mean, that could be like domestic realism in another 4 or 5 years here. That was a bad joke.
Whee! Oh, well, so it's a little bit after 5. Does anyone have any other questions? Any last words for us?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I hope, I feel like I read a lot about like the intro stuff and about me, and I was hoping to get more to the writing. So hopefully that was okay.
Yeah, I think it was great.
Okay, and yeah, I really appreciate the invitation. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Yes, I think it sounds like everybody really enjoyed the background about Basque and Spain. So
awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining us.
Hope to see you all in person sometime.
Absolutely. There is a standing invitation.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Take care.